Thank you. Thanks a lot for welcoming me in this very impressive facilities and welcoming me to give a speech at your annual forecasting dinner. I sometimes think that economic forecasts should carry the same warnings as cigarette packages, that excessive consumption can be dangerous, if not for your health, then your financial health. And that leads me to a distinction between different kinds of economists. I think the chairman mentioned the uncertainty of economic forecasts. For the man on the street, economists are often thought as anything from accountants over people doing financial planning to macroeconomists like me. But I think there's a very important difference in the sense that if you're an accountant, you need to get the right digit, the last digit of a number right. If you're a financial planner, you're happy if you get the first digit right. And if you're a macroeconomist like me, you're happy if you get the sign right. So that caveat should be attached to what I say here, and therefore I will also try, rather than to be sort of focusing a lot on numbers, to be a storyteller. My story starts with this picture of a Greek temple in the valley of Agrigento in Sicily. And the story goes back to my days at the European Central Bank, where our then chief economist, the German Ottmar Issing, was reviewing our so-called two-pillar strategy. And he had traveled down to Sicily and he saw the temples, the old Greek temples. And to his great dismay, he discovered that the pillars were falling apart. They were crumbling. And he thought of his two-pillar strategy and whether that was the same here in relation to that strategy. I think today, if you talk to Issing, he would think that the whole project of the Economic and Monetary Union is crumbling, and not least because of those who built the temple, the Greeks, who have been spearheading the initiatives to unplug the European and Monetary Union. But I think there's a more general issue in relation to sovereigns. I think we see it also every day in the world in relation, for example, in the US, where there are great sort of discussions on how do we finance the household. And I think that's the very basic economic question of financing the household, agreeing on a level of taxation and a level of expenditures which match. And that is a problem not only in Greece, but also in the most advanced economy in the world, in the US and in several other economies. With that said, I will try to start by looking at the financial crisis. I wrote a book about the financial crisis a few years ago called The Fall of Finance. I'm writing a book now called The Fall of Sovereigns on the Debt Crisis. I will go into the problems in the euro area. I will give you my view on where the world economy is heading. And I will end up by outlining some of the things which I think will change in relation to the financial industry. So that's my agenda. Where do we come from? This is the front page of the book. And the front page signifies the great gap which arose because of the financial crisis between the man on the street who had this sign saying, "Jump, you fuckers," to the people on Wall Street. This is not a reaction which you can criticize when you think about all the people who ended up being unemployed after the financial crisis. If you think about all the taxpayers' money which went into the financial sector, it's very easy to understand the reaction of the man on Main Street towards the financial sector. At the same time, I think it's one of the fundamental problems we are facing, that if we need to have growth again, somehow we need to have a financial system which works, which can finance the future growth. So what happened during the financial crisis? In our book, we point out that there was not one single guilty person driving the financial crisis, or one single thing driving the financial crisis. There was a multiplicity of factors, and because there was a multiplicity of factors, it was very difficult to see in advance. I tried to divide it up in sort of three things. One was that macroeconomic policies increased the risk appetite, most famously sort of expressed by the expression, the Greenspan put. Greenspan saved the world on a number of occasions, and everybody believed that he would hold the hand under the world if things were to go wrong again. And therefore, they were willing to bid up financial prices. So the macroeconomic policies, the monetary policies of the most advanced countries contributed to the crisis. But also the financial system, starting with the sort of almost attempt to be the modern-day alchemist by selling what was popularly called alpha. This belief that everybody could generate an excess return without taking any risks. That further increased the risk-taking appetite that everybody was out selling the alpha, which turned out to be fake alpha and which really turned out to have a lot of tail risk. Also, the leveraging of the world economy, the fact that banks were willing to give more and more credit and people took more and more leveraged positions, you had more and more money chasing the same assets and driving asset prices up. The US house price boom, the rating agencies which gave everybody AAA ratings and afterwards became as strict as anybody who went into a convent. The fact that the banking sector is so dependent on confidence that it's almost a game theoretical problem, that when everybody sort of decides that they do not have a confidence anymore, they leave and create liquidity problems. But also the checks and balances, starting with management here represented by Chuck Prince, who said the famous words that as long as the music keeps playing, we'll keep dancing. And he said that 1 month before everybody could see that the music had stopped playing. So the man on the top of the biggest institution in the world didn't see it coming, and I don't think it was because he was stupid, I think it was because it was too complex. Likewise, we who were central bankers or supervisors didn't see it coming either, and there were a lot of black swans flying around, and our major tool for looking into or trying to control the risk capital requirements worked exactly the opposite way as they should. Instead of following the principle of the Bible of saving up in the bad years, we ended up by reducing solvencies, saving up in the good years, we ended up by reducing solvency in the good years because of Basel II and international accounting standards. So we entered the crisis with very low solvency ratios. So there was not one father or mother for the financial crisis. It was the cause of a lot of things which came together, and that was why it was so difficult to see. When we wrote the book, there were two things which we predicted in terms of what could happen, where we were more right than we had hoped for. One was that we could enter a so-called Japanese scenario with low growth and inflation tendencies, and that has turned out to be more or less right, at least if you look over the last couple of years. The other was that the authorities, instead of taking a cautious approach and taking baby steps, would take big steps in terms of reining in the financial sector, and therefore being very pro-cyclical in terms of regulation. That also happened. These days, the EU is approving new directives and new regulations of more than 1,300 pages, which are not likely to be helping in generating finance for future growth. There was one thing we missed, and this is this man. This man had the choice when he was a teenager to become one of the best chess players in the world or become an economist. And who can believe it? He chose to become an economist. This is Kenneth Rogoff, who wrote This Time is Different together with Carmen Reinhardt. Every year in early January, I go to the most boring congregation of people, which is the meeting of the American Economic Association, where 8,000 men in gray suits and a very few women gather and listen in the cheapest weekend of the year in terms of when you could get hotels, the first weekend in January. And they never go to Las Vegas because the hotel owners know that economists don't gamble. So they don't want them there. But anyway, back in 2009, I heard Kenneth Rogoff telling about some of the studies he had been making, and one of the things he said was that after a financial crisis, you have a huge increase in government debt. You have an increase of around 86% on average. I heard it, I thought about it, and I forgot it when I wrote my book, and that has really been the cause of the crisis we stand in today in the European Union, which is a government debt crisis. If we look a little bit at European difficulties, going back to another event I go to regularly, which is the ECB Watchers Conference, which is held every summer. When I went there in 2009, everybody thought that the euro had survived the financial crisis very well. The ECB had done incredibly well in terms of flooding the gates with liquidity very early on. And everybody believed that we had avoided the typical exchange rate crisis which occur in Europe when you have these sort of crises. A year later, after the Greek situation started to unravel in May 2010, the views had changed dramatically. The view was now that too many ships had been let into the harbor, and that these ships were sinking and causing problems for the other ships in the harbor. So there was a dramatic shift in the perception of how the euro area had fared. Why did it go as it did? One of the things which went wrong was that some of the rules which were agreed, including the Stability and Growth Pact, were murdered. They were murdered by Schröder and Chirac, who committed a murder among friends by not observing the Stability and Growth Pact and overriding the political consequences of the deficit they had in the early zeros. If we look a little bit on how the Economic and Monetary Union has been a sedative, this is a chart which shows the fiscal position of a number of countries. And what you see is that some of these countries, Italy, Portugal, and Greece, could live in the shadow of the sins of the Germans and the French and run deficits which were way too large for quite a long time and which eventually led to their problems. But there were also two countries which actually did quite well in terms of the fiscal numbers, and that was Spain and Ireland. Spain and Ireland's problems was that they didn't have a fiscal deficit, but they had a private sector savings deficit and a huge growth of the financial sector which exploded. The sort of most significant consequence of that was that Ireland in 2010 had a deficit in its fiscal position of 32%, which is a huge number because they had to take over the liabilities of the financial sector. What does this show? I think it shows two things. One, that the rules of the game were not observed, and that was part of the problem. But it also showed that the rules were insufficient. We did not, when we constructed the Economic and Monetary Union, think sufficiently about the problems a private sector savings deficit could create and the problems a financial sector which exploded could create. So where are we now? We are in a situation where there's a huge difference in perception in terms of those who have deficits and those who have surpluses. This is not the question of men and women, it's the question of the countries in the periphery and Germany. At another meeting I went to in Berlin, I talked to some of my former friends, former colleagues at the European Central Bank, at the Bundesbank. And they expressed the view that every euro they sent south to Greece was a euro sent south to postpone adjustment. The next day, I had a dinner in London. I was sitting next to a very famous Greek professor who's an advisor to Samaras, a professor at Oxford who has published distinguished papers. And he started by asking me, which is the country which has had the biggest corruption scandals in Europe? I've been 25 years in central banking, so my diplomacy prohibited me from answering that question. But shortly afterwards, he said Germany. He said Volkswagen and Siemens. And then I got a sense of where he was heading when he asked the next question. The next question was, which countries broke the Stability and Growth Pact first? And I could answer Germany, and he was very happy. But I think this shows that there's a huge gap in the perception within the EU in terms of who are the sinners and who are the heroes, who has to adjust and who does not have to adjust. And that obviously doesn't make it easier. One person who made it a little bit easier was Draghi with his famous statement in July of 2012, where he bent the rules of the Economic and Monetary Union and said that he would defend it whatever it takes. And believe me, that would be enough. In doing that, he broke things which were sacrosanct when I was at the ECB in terms of monetary financing, prohibitions, and no bail-in clauses. But he managed to stop the rot. I don't think we're home yet. I think one of the issues we're facing, and I think that was shown last by the election in Italy, is that there are some years of extremely harsh adjustment ahead. There's one country which has actually done this, and that is Latvia. Latvia entered the financial crisis in very dire straits and adjusted very quickly and took some enormous drops in GDP, almost 20% in 2009. Greece is coming there, but I think they have further to go. You might ask the question, if Latvia could, why couldn't Greece? I think the answer is that Latvia had a Russian bear breathing down its neck. Greece doesn't have it. I think if you want Greece to do this, you should probably send some warships to Turkey and start them circling around Crete and other islands. There's a country which chose to go out, and the most famous example is Argentina. Argentina tried to peg their currency for many years to the dollar. It didn't work. They left. They had an economy which fell apart, but an economy which in its own narrow sense has actually done reasonably well afterwards. The problem, of course, is that this is in Argentine pesos or whatever they're called, and they're not worth quite what they were worth back in the old days. But for Argentina, it was the right thing to leave. Personally, I think if Greece was an isolated case, it was the right thing for Greece to leave rather than to stay in. The problem is it's not an isolated case. The problem is it would create a lot of contagion. If we turn our focus to the world economy at large, I think the world economy right now is being steered by what Keynes called animal spirits. And I think the spirits are pretty bearish. I think most people are fairly pessimistic, at least in large parts of Europe, and believe that they will not necessarily sort of invest in new factories, they will not take home inventories, they will not build a new kitchen, they will not buy a new car because they're afraid of what will happen next. If we look a little bit at what I would consider the headwinds and the tailwinds of the world economy, I will go through some headwinds and I will go through some tailwinds. I think one of the major headwinds is the debt situation. This shows a picture of a small kid which stands with his father looking at a mountain of debt. And the father says, sometime all of this will be yours. That is not an environment in which you're going to go out and spend a lot of money if you know you have to reduce debt. And that was also Rogoff's message, that debt crisis, financial crisis, takes many years before the world economy gets back on tracks. There's another issue, and that's the trust issue of bankers. The right picture shows the CEO of a Danish bank in a Danish television series who made inroads with a long staff member by saying, trust me, I'm a banker. That was not a smart move on either of the two. And I think today that sort of statement is unlikely to bring the rewards which he got. If I may also go back to sort of the banking industry and some simple banking models. I reviewed last summer a study on Danish banking. And in that study, it was written that the first Danish bank was this bank, which you see on the left side, which was Sparekassen, which is a savings bank for a local county in the island of Fyn, which was founded in 1810. That bank seemed to have a rock-solid business model. It took deposits at 3%, and it invested them in government bonds at 4%. Unfortunately, what happened in Denmark was that 3 years later, in 1813, we had a government bankruptcy. So even what seemed like rock-solid business models can flounder. And I think that's one of the issues we are standing in front of today, that banks who have, partly led by Basel II, invested heavily in government bonds have learned that that is not a safe investment. Another issue is the US fiscal cliff. These are the numbers that they looked at the start of the year. Now they are much less. I don't think the fiscal cliff will turn out to be a major issue in itself. But I think it's a symptom of what I described to you before, this inability of most democracies to agree on a level of taxes and a level of expenditures which match. And I think that is a pretty disturbing fact for sovereigns looking ahead. Then there's this man, this is Ben Bernanke, which I put into the fairy tale story of the Emperor's New Clothes. I think it is incredibly important that there is nobody who says that Ben Bernanke is not in control of inflation expectations. Because if we first start believing that we are in a deflationary environment, then there's very little central banks can do in terms of having a monetary policy which generates future growth. So let us pray that there won't be that little kid which says that Bernanke is not in control. Then there's Chinese demographics. I don't think that's an issue in the near term, but I think in the longer term, we will have a demographic change in China and a huge increase in pensioners because of the one-child policy. And that increase in pensioners will generate lower growth in China because it will generate lower savings and will generate lower labor input. This is something which is unavoidable. It will come within 10 years. Finally, there's Europe's way through what I would call the swamp. I mean, if you looked at it sort of from above, there were two right things to do. One thing would be to narrow the economic and monetary union to those countries which really belonged. The other thing is to go for full integration. Both of those things are painful. One is throwing somebody out, another is giving up sovereignty. Therefore, Europe has moved through the swamp, jumping from stone to stone instead of taking one of the two. If anything, there seems to be a tendency to go for the full union, with all the difficulties it creates in terms of democratic legitimacy in relation to the man on the street in Palermo, in Bratislava, or in Copenhagen. Are there only headwinds? Are there no tailwinds? I think there are some tailwinds. I think the one thing we can hope for is the US housing cycle. If you look at US house prices, recently they have increased. That was what started the financial crisis. As these house prices start to reverse, I think we are in for a better economic development in the US. I think it's the US which is going to drag us out of this mess. The other thing which happens on a slightly longer term is that the US will become self-sufficient when it comes to oil and gas. That could hopefully drive a positive supply shock down the road. It will change geopolitics. The US might have less of an interest in the Middle East. and we will see Chinese warships circulating around the Persian Gulf because they're the ones who will have an interest there. But in terms of economic development, it could generate a positive supply shock. And then finally, there's my favorite metaphor, the metaphor of the burning platform. If you ever had a burning platform which forced you to do something, it's today. And I think some of the structural measures which are being undertaken in many countries are really impressive. The burning platform metaphor is this metaphor which goes back to the management literature in terms of if you stand on a burning platform, you have no alternative but to jump. It also applies to economics. I think you might give you a few examples. One was Thatcher's turnaround of the UK economy when it was on the brink in the late 70s. Another was Ireland in '88, where Economist had a famous front page where it said, "Large man which leaves Ireland, remember to turn off the light." And subsequently, they reformed and generated many years of growth. I think Europe is potentially in that situation today, and we can hope that some of the structural measures, if we manage to go through the fire, will bring us in a situation which will be much better. Make your bets in terms of what the future scenario is. I propose 3. One scenario is sort of the typical rubber band scenario of economists. Economists have a tendency, whenever you drag them down like a rubber band, they swing back at some stage and you get back to some steady state growth in a few years. I would put 50% of my money on that scenario. But I still think there are 2 very different outlier scenarios which I would also propose to you. One is the Japanese scenario of continued low growth, deflationary tendencies. I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think that could still arise, and I would put 25% of my money on that. And then finally, there's the completely opposite scenario of high inflation. And you might wonder, I mean, how can he speak about Japan on the one hand and high inflation on the other hand? I think if we get out of the Japanese mess we're in right now, I think there's a risk that we cannot hit the brakes sufficiently quick. We don't know when we run into the wall of potential output. And furthermore, I think in some countries there could be huge incentives to inflate the debt away. I think that incentive is likely to be the biggest in Britain, and when you read the Financial Times and British commentators, you hear them talking constantly about, God, if we could just get inflation up there. The danger, of course, is once you get it up there, it's very difficult to get back down. I would put 25% of my money on that. But I leave it to you to make your bets on these 2 scenarios, which are widely different. I'm not finished yet. If I may say a little bit about banks. Banks, sort of, if you draw them up very narrowly, they have loans on the asset side and liquid assets. And then on the liability side, they have liquid deposits and capital. And they are a wonderful instrument in terms of generating growth because you can take your and my deposits and use them to finance growth. But they're also like a nuclear power plant. If things go wrong and if we have a run, then you will first lose your liquid assets, then you will have to sell your loans at below par, then you will lose your capital, and then you would go bust, which is why there's an incentive to be the first in a bank run. So banks are the nuclear power plant of the economy, in the good days generating future growth, in the bad day being very unstable. So what do regulators do? They say they need more liquid assets and more capital. That obviously makes it more difficult and more expensive to run a bank, and that generates less growth. So how would that influence the banking industry? Building on somebody had some success with, I don't know, 4,000 years ago, I will provide you with my 10 commandments very quickly. My first commandment is that regulatory complexity is likely to increase. This is the large page of the Danish regulation on solvency. It has 237 pages. I tell you, this regulation will become a lot longer. It will be very, very difficult to be a small bank, figure out what's going on. The other thing is that the importance of banks will diminish. I mean, we are taxing the banking sector, so the supply curve shifts up left, prices increase, and goods in equilibrium supply becomes less. And as banks become less important, non-banks will grow. My favorite example, I don't know whether you have the same in the Czech Republic, is that whenever we tax beers and soda water in Denmark, what happens is that people start driving south of the border to Germany to buy it. People in finance will do the same. They will try to circumvent banks, and you will have a shadow banking system. And the picture on the left, which shows the shadow banking system in the US before the financial crisis, was drawn up by the Federal Reserve 3 years into the financial crisis. And regulators will be changing the shadow banks, just like the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in Wayne, because the shadow banking system will have an incredible capacity to mutate. My fourth commandment is that banks are likely to become much more like utilities. This is showing sort of the narrow banking concept, which is very popular in the US, where if you take deposits, you're only allowed to have liquid assets. I don't think we'll have that in Europe, but I think we'll converge in that direction where there will be a lot of requirements on the largest banks in order in terms of what they will do, and they will become more like utilities. They will be regulated like nuclear power plants because authorities are very afraid that they blow up and destroy nations as they did in Iceland, and they were close to do in England and Switzerland. Then I think we will need a spare wheel, a financial spare wheel like in the US. This shows the financial liabilities of US corporates. And what you see is the red line, which is corporate bonds, which is basically an outstanding amount of about 5,000. Corporate bonds amount to just as much as bank lending and mortgage lending in terms of funding for the non-financial corporates. And that has been a blessing for the US economy because, as you see, during the financial crisis in 2009, the red curve actually goes up, which shows that the corporate bonds was the spare wheel in the American financial industry when the banks went flat. My sixth commandment is that we will have a race to cross the line first in terms of the new solvency and liquidity requirements. Because if you are an investor and you have the choice to bet on somebody who is just about to cross the finishing line or somebody who has a plan to cross the finishing line in 2019, you will bet on those you're certain will cross the finishing line. And therefore, everybody will try to do it, and therefore you will see huge divestments in banks in order to achieve it. My seventh statement is taken from McKinsey, and that is that the return on banking, just at the time when banks need to go out to raise equity, the return on equity will drop. McKinsey's estimate is 5%. I don't know what the number is, but I can tell you with more equity, there will be a drop in the return on equity. My eighth commandment is that products will be repriced. This is also taken from McKinsey. This shows a lump of products. The short story is that products which require a lot of capital and a lot of liquidity will become a lot more expensive. Long-dated swaps is my favorite example. Long-dated swaps will become very expensive because they require a lot of capital and a lot of liquidity. My ninth commandment is that banks will go domestic. This is a piggyback of IceSave, the Icelandic bank, which caused a lot of problems in England and Holland, where England they actually invoked the terrorism legislation and was about to send warships to Iceland. Fortunately for the Icelandic, they just lost the case, not Iceland, but England. But I think there's a general hesitancy in many countries towards foreign banks which are not supervised by strong supervisors. And at the same time, as you have probably felt in the Czech Republic, there's a lot of hesitancy, exemplified by the Austrian Central Bank, on banks, domestic banks, which take risk abroad. And there's a lot of pressure on reducing those risks and withdrawing within their domestic borders. And finally, I think the key thing in order to get out of this mess is to restore confidence. I think that's a task which goes back to some of the issues which was addressed by the chairman here and the central bank governor, that we all have a huge job in restoring the faith in the financial sector. It's important for us in terms of our jobs, but it's also important for the financial industry so that we do not have people telling us to jump out of the windows, and we have people who have faith in us, and we can generate the finance which is needed for growth in the future. So what are the lessons to be learned for banks and authorities? I think we will see a circumvention in banks in the future. I think for banks, the name of the game is to try to use their credit expertise to be part of that new value chain where things are not necessarily on the balance sheet of banks. I think we need to reinvent our business model. We have to avoid to become the last typewriter producer as we see the most fundamental change in the paradigm of financial regulations we've ever seen. And finally, we need to think of that despite all the things going on in Europe, we have a Europe which is worth fighting for. I remember when I worked in Frankfurt, every single day in the morning, when I walked to the office, I walked past a bakery shop where there was a picture of Frankfurt as it looked after the Second World War. Frankfurt was bricks which were pushed apart so you could see the roads and a little bit of the cathedral standing. And I think that's the essence of the European idea. And I think you, here in the Czech Republic, have also experienced in terms of being reintegrated in Europe after having been separated from Europe, and so has a lot of Southern European dictatorships. On top of that, we have an internal market which generates a lot of welfare. So I think we have a lot to believe in terms of Europe. We have a Europe which has to continue to exist and work together, but probably in finding new ways to do that. And when we look at it, I think the key thing, and this is below, is a picture from my CEO's hometown in southern Denmark, which I showed him. that the task of the CEOs, the task of the policymakers in the euro area, is actually to convince the man and the woman on Main Street in the most desolate areas of their respective countries that we can restore confidence, and that it's worth believing not only in financial systems but also in government so that we can restore that growth. If I may end with a short anecdote which more reflects me as an economist. That's a story, it was Reagan's favorite story about economists. It goes back to a military parade in Moscow in the last days of the Soviet Empire. And the American ambassador was sitting next to Gorbachev. And you saw all these millions of troops walking by. You saw the tens of thousands of tanks and cannons and the thousands of airplanes and the rockets and all of that. And then at the end came 5 men in gray suits. And the American ambassador wondered and sort of poked Gorbachev on his shoulder and said, "Who are these guys?" And Gorbachev answered, "These are my economists. They're capable of destroying the world." I hope that won't happen. I hope something better will happen. Thank you.